Hello, my name is Maxwell Tabin. I'm the producer and UI artist for Aphotic Descent.
My name is Gracie Sanabria, and I'm the creative director of Aphotic Descent.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sean Gunter, and I was the code lead for Aphotic Descent.
Hi, I'm Sarah Ritzi, and I'm the art lead and the 2D artist on Aphotic Descent.
Hi, my name is Jared Tapes, and I was the design lead, QA lead, and Foley artist for Aphotic Descent.
Hi, my name is Alejandro Franquez, and I worked as accessibility lead and gameplay programmer on Aphotic Descent.
Hi, my name is Daniel Hudson. I was the narrative lead, music creator, and one of the voice actors on Aphotic Descent.
Me and my team members are going to be walking through the entire creation and behind the scenes of Aphotic Descent. We're going to be going over everything from the concept and pitch phase, to production, to the vertical slice, and to the full-fledged release on Steam. We're going to be talking about what worked, what didn't work, our processes for creating narrative, design, art, code, mechanics, etc., and everything in between. So let's just dive right into it. So Aphotic Descent started off as a pitch and game design workshop, one that was just one pitch among 11 other game pitches that were created by other classmates, and every pitch had to discuss its main storyline, game genre, setting, unique mechanics, and gameplay goals. Along with this, they included original concept sketches of environments, characters, and mood boards.
So the original pitch of Aphotic Descent was actually kind of different than it is now. But even when it moved from the original two-sentence pitch to the pitch team I got to work with, there was really kind of like this massive overhaul of everybody's ideas coming together. Such as some of the things that we wanted to have was we wanted to be a horror game, we wanted to be in first person, we wanted to have kind of like just like a underwater lab, like you are in the lab most of the time was the original idea, and going throughout different parts and descending down.
I originally was not going to work on Aphotic Descent. It was only because the previous semester I already did a horror game, so I just didn't want to do that again. But then Max asked me to work with him, and then he introduced me to Sarah, and we immediately hit it off, and we basically became a trio of besties immediately. Because this was a pitch I wasn't initially crazy about, I stayed pretty conservative and focused on the team's wants and what they wanted to see, with the game pitch that was basically about a lab that was deep down in the ocean, which had a bunch of mutated monsters. I felt like the pitch was kind of missing some sort of twist that would make it more interesting than it already was. I would say that the pitch was pretty strong, as it attracted a lot of strong team members, so we had a pretty good team. I was pretty confident about that. But I was kind of stuck for a while on like what to do with this pitch. I felt like something was missing.
We did lose a few ideas along the way, such as the beloved Echo Gun, but besides that we did have some ideas that obviously stayed, such as being the diver himself. He was kind of like made to be a vintage or antique looking diving suit, which I personally kind of believe like set the vibe for most of the game, with having a retro or vintage kind of feel. And even one of the original monster concept being Shrimp Man, who also made it into the final game. And he kind of also set the basis, or kind of like the vibe, for some of the other monsters. That being man-made horrors and abominations.
After everyone in class voted on the pitches, it was eventually whittled down to the final two games that would be worked on for the rest of the year. The producers, creative directors, and vision holders then drafted teams from the rest of the classmates after going over everyone's individual brands and based on what game they preferred to work on out of the two finalists, which eventually led us to our team of 19 people that worked on Aphotic Descent. So for Sprint 2, essentially, we had to create an art prototype and a code prototype, so it was a proof of concept for our mechanics and our art assets. But before we could start doing that, one of the important conversations that we had with our professor is he talked about that the pitch for this game was set as a lab that is underwater. But what he thought would be better for the game as a whole in the process is that we switch from a lab that is just underwater to the game primarily being just underwater, swimming among these creatures in the water. And there could be some parts on land, but mostly and primarily it was underwater.
Ironically, when we finally came up with something to do with our lab, our professor told us to kind of like space ourselves away from it and focus more on the underwaterness of the game. So at first we weren't really sure what we were supposed to do with that, because that basically meant starting over completely. We had to completely change all of our plans, all of our concepts, because again, this was a game about a lab, not necessarily about the ocean or anything between that. We had planned for an eel enemy and like a burrowing shrimp enemy, but nothing more than that. We were kind of still fixated on developing this massive cool lab that you explore in the bottom of the sea. At the same time, these drastic changes were really exciting because that meant that we could create really dynamic and diverse underwater environments that a full metal interior lab might have not been able to achieve. So this ended up planting the seed for super radical ideas in the future.
So, Sprint 2 was a crazy time in the project, as the initial plan for the game was not going to include a swimming mechanic because it was going to be in a lab, but we were then told that we needed to be more underwater, so we planned on doing a swimming mechanic. And this was also when we planned on removing the echo gun and instead replace it with a knife. At first, I was definitely a little worried about doing the swimming mechanic, as it was something I had never really done before, and I wasn't really sure how it was going to work out, especially when it came to like trying to confine the player to spaces, because we didn't want the player to be able to swim like infinitely places, because even though it was underwater, we still wanted like a more linear kind of structure to the game, which meant that we had to design our encounters and our areas definitely a lot more specifically around this. But at the end, it actually worked out pretty well, and it wasn't actually that hard to set up, especially once we started using our stamina system, which was a great tool at keeping the player kind of confined, as they couldn't swim forever with that, yeah. Some other mechanics that we planned on including during this period of the time were a flashlight, as the game was going to be rather dark, and we just thought like a flashlight would be cool. A blacklight mechanic, which essentially worked as like a secondary mode to the flashlight, where you would shine purple light on things, and then at the time, it was just kind of used to reveal certain objects in the environment. But later that progressed and we changed it a little bit on like what it actually did. But yeah, that the actual blacklight mechanic didn't necessarily change. An invisibility mechanic, which would be used to simply just like a boolean that would just check, like other enemies would just check if you were invisible or not, and then if you were, they would kind of like stop detecting you type of situation. And finally, the stamina system, which I mentioned briefly before.
So the art prototype was kind of more of like the entire team really figuring out what we wanted the game to be, what we wanted to feel like, and what we wanted to look like. And so we knew a few things. We would have it underwater, and sometimes underwater can be very pretty. So we figured out some stuff for the underwater natural environments, such as using the use of emissives or very pretty serene colors to kind of give it almost like a mystical look outside. It's still kind of spooky with like the dark lights, but we kind of want it to look a little bit pretty and very flowy, as opposed to the next part, having it the man-made structures, in which we remembered that we were supposed to make a scary game, and we kind of went over ideas for the cramped hallways idea, and having the man-made structures kind of look very function over form, and kind of the opposite of the nature outside of the lab. The original models of some of the monsters and some of the other characters, such as Shrimp Man and the Angler, And for those two, we kind of focused on the nautical aspects, like kind of like the nautical spookiness of them. For instance, you don't really like the idea of all those creepy crawly legs on Shrimp Man, as well as the human part of him, in which it's kind of a messed up looking form, and we kind of wanted to show it that we were still a scary game.
So after Sprint 2, with the art prototype and the code prototype, it was finally start to get into Sprint 3, where we eventually switched into a whole different scene, and we took those assets and those mechanics that we had started on and improved and refined them for the sprint in an actual level. So we started off by creating our tutorial in the submarine that has crashed, and we've also started creating the first kelp maze with our first enemy, the freakfish.
From these drastic changes we had to deal with, we came up with the concept of ocean zones. We ended up dividing the game into 3 sections: the Sunlight Zone, the Twilight Zone, and the Midnight Zone, and these sections were based off of our real-life ocean zones. Sprint 3 was really weird because this was right after our prototype, where we basically showed off our initial assets and our mechanics, and so we ended up starting to actually make the game. So we created our first level, which was a primitive version of the kelp maze, and also our first enemy, which was the freakfish. And this began the no horror allegations. This meant that the game was being accused of being not scary and not horrific. And I simply...
Sprint 3 was when we made the decision to incorporate the PSX renderer, or in simpler terms, it was simply just an effect that kind of mimicked the style of early PlayStation games, the visuals of it. We did this because we wanted our game to stand out visually, and we didn't really want to try to tread the line of this realistic horror simulation game that we felt had been done enough times and didn't really feel unique to us at the time. So we kind of went with the PSX renderer. In terms of mechanics, not much at this point had changed, except for the fact that they were more set up in a linear fashion, instead of whereas in Sprint 2 we kind of had a code scene which kind of showed off on this area here, this is kind of what this mechanic does, and this area this is what this mechanic does. And instead we had more of a linear style to our game, where you started in the submarine, went to the kelp maze, and then you used those mechanics during those sections. At this point in the project as well, we had decided to make the game 4x3, which we kind of did because we felt it fit we felt it fit the aesthetic style of the PlayStation renderer, and it also kind of helps in a horror setting, or a setting with a lot of suspense in it, because it's almost this tightly confined box, and it gives the player less kind of visual field of view on their sides.
So once it was decided that we put more of a focus on the oceanic aspects of our game, it definitely had a pretty pivotal effect on the narrative. We sort of had a very big meeting right after this change, where we talked about, in the future, design, code, art, all of these things can affect the narrative. And since such a big change has already happened, how are we going to handle that? So we decided to put more of a focus on the environmental aspects of the story. Man versus nature, how the lab's inhabitants had affected things, rather than just what happened to the lab. Though that still had its own place in the story as part of the pitch. But we wanted to put more of a focus on the surrounding wildlife and environment, rather than the human characters that the original pitch had focused on.
So after Sprint 3, we eventually got to Sprint 4, which was the vertical slice. With the vertical slice comes some big and major changes. You have to add a lot to get your vertical slice to be a full playable demo of the game, which is basically what the vertical slice is. We added a lot of new things throughout this process. Our first new main menu, the first intro and outro cutscenes, the first version of the diver model with its actual functioning hands, and the first version of our UI. And we also added 2 whole new areas, the first version of the Crab Lab and the Eel Cave.
The vertical slice was arguably the most stress I'd ever received during the project. I was literally having dreams about working in Aphotic Descent. Whenever I woke up, the first thing on my mind was Aphotic Descent and a checklist of things to do. And then on top of that, I would work non-stop for hours in the engine. I had literally become the Joker. I pushed so hard for a playable version of the lab to get in. And even more so, I pushed even harder for our eel boss and its story, Frankenstein, to get in. This poor baby went through 4 redesigns, 3 encounter redesigns. It was textured twice because the first time its UVs were messed up, and then also its animations had to be done through a procedural animation plugin. We went through a lot that week, and it was really bad. His encounter was literally done the night before the vertical slice was due. I worked on the stage, I populated it to make it feel somewhat complete, and then poor Sean had to work day and night, well, one night entirely, to get the AI to work correctly for the build. At the end of the day, our VS was great. It was awesome, but some of us looked like zombies the day of the presentation.
Oh man, Sprint 4. Yeah, Sprint 4. Sprint 4 was a crazy time in the project. This was Sprint 4 is obviously when the vertical slice was due, and there was a lot of changes from Sprint 3. A ton of work went into the project at this point. Like 2 new areas were added in. Code-wise, honestly, not much had changed for the players' mechanics, but we did revamp a lot of other systems. So this is when we added the first kind of logs to the game, where you could pick those up and then you could read some lore about the game and stuff like that. And a bunch of puzzles were set up inside of the lab using all the mechanics, stuff like that. But the biggest thing in Sprint 4 was doing the eel encounter at the final, like it's the final boss of the sprint, or as the vertical slice. That guy, he was done in one day by me. The initial version of him, as we progressed later in the project, he was iterated upon heavily. But the initial version was done by me in one day because we needed it to be done that day, and we were like, we gotta get this done.
The lab, being one of the denser areas, needed a little bit more spice to make the critical path more interesting, and to do that, I had to coordinate with the designers a lot to craft the puzzles within the lab to make sure they fit the experience of the game. They're all pretty simple, and their systems are just based off manager scripts that check their variables, like the barnacle puzzle, the door puzzle, the code computer puzzle, and the hidden switch puzzle. They really are just like checks on like, oh, is this interacted with, is this done, blah 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 blah. But because they were so simple, they were pretty easy. The base system was pretty easy to reuse later on, and that was super helpful in like adding puzzles later on in the game.
So as for the music, we sort of wanted to put a focus on the narrative theme of descending through the different levels of the ocean. And when I talked to Ezra and Grimm, they sort of wanted to really hammer down on that, so we all decided to work on a melody together that started from a very high F that eventually made its way to a completely lower octave and stayed there for the majority of it. That's sort of a consistent theme for a lot of our music. A lot of it has obviously ties to the in-moment action, but all of it sort of has a repeating theme of starting higher and ending a bit more of a lower octave or lower tone.
When creating the sound effects for the vertical slice, I did a technique called the Foley method. It's a form of making sound effects where I use objects around me and post-processing effects to create the sounds for the game. At the time, I was newer to the Foley method, not off to make a large batch of sounds without knowing if those sounds would fit into the game. As the sprints went on, I got better at making sounds with a specific purpose. One of my favorite sounds in the game that I made for the vertical slice was the kelp breaking sound. I recorded myself hitting a fake bamboo plant with a stack of paper towels, and then I added a little bit of effects. After all that, the sound was born, and a lot of people told me that it was one of their favorite sounds in the game, so I guess it was a fan favorite.
So we actually took a panoramic approach to our cutscenes, in which it would just kind of help create a sense of flow in these cinematics, but also sometimes add to the storytelling itself, such as the intro cutscene, in which it would have a top to bottom shot. It would just kind of add to the descent theme of the game. With some of them, it would just simply be a left to right kind of deal, but paired with narration, it was just kind of a very smooth and flowy cinematic to watch. As well as that, creating those was a very interesting process, as the lovely creative director, Gracie, would make these little doodles that sometimes were just kind of a generous amount of lines, but they were coherent and they were beautiful to me. And so taking those, she would give them to me, I would take those, kind of like create a few sketches, get the idea, give it back to her. We would go back and forth a little bit trying to understand the vision, and then really just come out with the end product of these big murals that would be the cinematics. And I found it to be a really interesting but surprisingly effective tactic to go about creating those cinematics.
So after the completion of Sprint 4, which was the vertical slice, we had winter break. And winter break, most people just took a break and didn't even want to think about it in the game. And some people in our group did that. But there also were some people in our group that wanted to keep working through the break. So we got a bunch of stuff actually in during winter break, which was really good. We got animations, some new sounds. We fixed a bunch of bugs, worked on some of the encounters a little bit. So that actually saved us a good amount of stuff that had to get done during Sprint 5 when it actually started when we returned. But when we did return from break for Sprint 5, we kind of jumped right back at it, but mostly with looking at the Q&A and playtesting feedback that we got from other students. And we took Sprint 5 as a quality of life kind of sprint to adjust, the mechanics a little bit, make some changes so that they felt better. Some people said this mechanic didn't work. The knife should do this, the flashlight should feel like that, etc., etc. So we took that to make a bunch of changes that helped the overall feeling of the games.
During winter break, I grabbed a couple people to work with me and focus some bit of time to revamp the lab and revamp some of our enemies, and also revamp how we consider making levels. During the vertical slice, I found that building the lab was actually very painful, and we needed to find a more enjoyable and efficient way of doing so. And so we found that using modular kits was probably not the move for our game that kind of focused more on very unnatural elements underwater. And so the uniformity part only kind of stayed with the lab, and that was very exclusive and special with the lab. While the rest of the game kind of focused more on making custom assets that were original and had very curvaceous parts to it, while the lab stayed very square. Another update that came during the sprint was actually the monster encyclopedia. I figured that if we're gonna have a game about scientists underwater, and we also have an investigative mechanic with picking up notes, why don't we also play as a scientist underwater? And so this actually allowed us to develop our enemies, or our monsters, not just as enemies, but also as characters. And this kind of created a snowball effect to focus more on a monster-first narrative, to have this game and story focus a lot on the creatures themselves. We kind of had this with the eel subplot in the lab, but we really wanted to do more with this concept.
We faced an issue during Sprint 5 with our very first encounter where players often got frustrated with the freakfish killing them from behind with little to no indication that they were close to the player. We talked about it and came up with the solution that we would create ambient breathing sounds for the diver. Towards the game, the diver's breathing may go unnoticed, blending in with the music or the other sounds of the game. But whenever an enemy is chasing the player, the breathing increases in tempo to indicate that the player is in danger. It is a very small but really impactful change that brings more immersion into our game.
One of the biggest changes, though, code-wise at this point in the project was that the flashlight didn't use battery pickups anymore because, one, it was kind of just not fun to look for battery pickups everywhere. And the biggest reason was because it just soft-locked the game if you ran out of battery at certain sections, which obviously is no bueno. Some other changes that weren't necessarily code-specific, but definitely helped. Visually, that I added in was the fog cube, which essentially it was just like a giant inverted cube that I got one of our artists, Grim, to make for me. And I essentially just placed this around our levels, and what this did was the fog in Unity by default doesn't actually render on like on the skybox. So what this did is it made edges on the terrain and stuff like that where you could tell where the fog ended, and it looked pretty visually jarring to the player. So the fog cube basically fixed this because it was just a giant inverted cube where the insides couldn't actually be seen, but the outsides could be seen if you're outside of it, but obviously you're never going to go outside of the fog cube. And it basically caused like the box around that area to kind of have like fog, like condensed, which made the game, one, feel more underwater, which obviously helps because we're an underwater game, and two, it just gave a little bit more visual clarity, kind of overall, to the project. Another thing that was added in this point was also the caustics, which was something that we found, or something that our professor found online, and then he shared it on LinkedIn, and I remember our producer seeing it and was like, we gotta have that. So we ended up buying it, and implementing it was pretty simple, and it just completely changed the visual style of our game and definitely made it look way more underwater, way more realistic, way more natural.
So for Sprint 6, we had a lot more major updates than in Sprint 5, which was more quality of life. We had some major changes, including an update to our main menu. First look at the new Crab Lab, which got a complete overhaul from the last Crab Lab that was seen in the vertical slice. And we also got to see the Mud Marsh and the Trench, which is where some other encounters are going to happen. We also created the first version of Pistol Shrimp and his wall climbing mechanic. And we also got to see the first version of the Angler encounter, with the Angler just kind of moving around in the trench. We also had some big UI changes. One of the things we did was we rehauled the UI to be the diver's helmet and redid kind of how the flashlight and stamina bars looked and felt. And we also added spots for the invisibility mechanic and a soon-to-add sonar mechanic that didn't get in for this sprint, but would later be added in Sprint 7 and 8. We made a version that was for the basic diver suit that you get in the beginning of the game, and then the upgraded diver suit that you get later in the game, so that when you grabbed the new suit, the UI matched.
We ended up introducing an unbelievable amount of new areas to the game. While the kelp maze remained the same, we completely revamped our lab. We completely revamped our eel arena, and then we added tunnels and a cave system to the mid-sea ridge. On top of that, we also introduced the Mud Marsh and the Trench with the ship graveyard in it. This was probably the most risky decision in the game, but in the end it had a really good resolution, because having this linear structure physically existing in the game was very helpful for developing the types of interactions we wanted the player to go through, as well as the diversity of the environments. We stayed within our Ocean Zones theme, and I began to truly beat the horror allegations. The end of our game was in sight, and it was starting to flesh out this deep sea adventure.
So Sprint 6 is where things really started to jump back into full swing for the code team. We started on many different AI, including the Pistol Shrimp, the Shrimp Man, and the Scuttling Isopods. In Sprint 5, there wasn't like a ton to do as we were waiting, but Sprint 6, it was like, bang, here's like all these new areas, so code team, go crazy. So we're like, okay. And we ended up doing all these different AIs, working on them, and I took over on the Pistol Shrimp encounter, which was one of our AIs that basically walked on walls, which was really cool. And on making the Pistol Shrimp be able to walk on walls, but actually being able to see it, like walking on walls, was like a big, like, okay, yeah, we can definitely do this situation. The person who initially started the Pistol Shrimp and like figured out the walking on walls was one of our coders, Aaron. But I was then handed the actual encounter section of it, so this is kind of where I started working on it as well, and I was the one who took it from like our scene that we used to kind of test things, and I actually put it into our main scene. So, yeah.
Sprint 6 was when I got to fully lean into my role as accessibility lead, and one of the biggest hurdles I had to get over in that role was control rebinding, because that those systems are built on the new input system, and we had been doing the mechanics on the old input system for 5 whole sprints. So, as you can imagine, it took forever to get everything checked to make sure that, this is working the new input system. Do we have to do events here and there? There's a bunch of different ways of doing it, but I'm pretty happy with how it came out. Even if the menus took a while, even if checking everything took a while, it's a great feature to have, so I'm honestly pretty happy that it managed to get in. Sprint 6 brought about a really interesting challenge in having to add a whole second phase to a boss fight. And while the initial mechanics weren't figured out until later, stuff like getting the eel to move vertically, things like not having invisibility, and moving around things like the generators in order to account for that verticality were pretty interesting challenges. The verticality was honestly the biggest challenge because we had to rework how the AI worked entirely since it couldn't use nav mesh anymore. So that took a while. But at the end of the day, it got done. There was a bit of rebalancing that had to be done, which is why we added the safe spaces, but it honestly turned out great.
So for sprints 7 and 8, we combined them because there was just so much that got done in these 2 sprints before the sprint 9, which was the end of the class and the eventual release on version to Steam, that we decided to combine them just because there was so much. We had a bunch of new changes to mechanics. The black light got changed from just a turning on and showing up to a charge up and burst out effect that the player would hold down the key and then eventually charge up and burst. We felt this was a little more fair and worked with a little bit better with all the mechanics and the encounters. We also added the sonar that was talked about in Sprint 6, which would ping interactables, enemies, and pickups throughout the game. They would be different colors. That made sense, and they would get some tweaks later on, but basically that was the sonar mechanic and helped with visualizing for players in the game that didn't use audio. It also was kind of like our replacement of the echo gun, which was like originally talked about in the pitch, kind of making its resurface in the game. Along with this, in Sprint 7 and Sprint 8, the pause menu also received some major updates to the encyclopedia, or the decks, whichever one you want to call it, with adding different locked mechanics and lore for each creature, where they wouldn't update until you actually picked up the lore or you beat the creature's encounter. So Frankie Eelstein and Freakfish and all of them would be locked until you got to the next section of the game, where eventually it would unlock, and then any lore pickups you didn't pick up would still be question marked out, but the ones that you did pick up would fill in the slots.
Our monsters are not just compelling through our narrative, but also through their mechanics. So one of our best examples is actually 2 of our shrimp. They're meant to work together as a duo in a later encounter. Shrimpman will attempt to grab the player from below, which forces the player to swim up, but then there's the pistol shrimp, who will constantly target the player, forcing the player to be very wary about how they use their stamina and how they position themselves in the environment. These 2 different mechanics balance each other out to create a challenging encounter, but if the player is able to get past them, they feel like they've outsmarted a pair of shrimp.
Sprint 7 and 8, I mean they were just pure chaos. There was just so much to do. We literally had a million things to do, a checklist that never ended, polish everything, sounds for everything, just pure insanity, honestly. Some of the biggest changes, though, included revamping the flashlight slash blacklight system entirely, once again, because we never were satisfied with it until this point. The flashlight no longer used any charge, because we're just what's even the point of having it run down and then waiting for it? You didn't really feel panicked. You were just kind of well, that's kind of annoying. So we decided to get rid of that whole part of it, and instead you could just turn it on and off whenever you wanted. The blacklight was changed by allowing the player to charge the blacklight, basically. So basically now, instead of just having the flashlight on and pressing the blacklight button and just turning on and you keeping it on, you had to hold down the button and then it filled up a bar, and then once it reached the top of the bar, you basically emitted a burst of blacklight for a quick a second in front of you, and then the bar would go down, and then you would use it again once it went all the way down, and it would fill back up, and you repeat that. This was also where I finished the encounter for the pistol shrimp. So how the encounter works is you start off in like a giant horizontal, huge room that just goes straight forward. And basically you would step on a trigger, and once you did that, the pistol shrimp on the wall over to the right of you would start attacking you by aiming his laser at you, which was just like a line renderer, and which is just like a line renderer that would basically detect if it was hitting you or not. And after like a couple seconds, he would fire a shot, and if it hit you, you took damage. If not, then it would reset. But during this time, the pistol shrimp would be walking on the wall, and there'd be a cage way out in front of you, coming down from the ground, coming down from like the sky. And the player's job is they need to get into that cage before it fully closes, otherwise they die. But once you get inside the cage, it doesn't end there either. So once you get inside the cage, your objective changes from getting into the cage to basically destroying all the biolamps in the area. So they start off inside of cages that have like ropes on them. They go up to the ceiling, and the only way to get them out of their cages to be able to blacklight them, which is what would cause the pistol shrimp to shoot them and break them for you, because he doesn't like light, which is like, was you had to knife the rope, the cage would fall, the cage would break open, the biolamp would show up, and then you need to blacklight that biolamp. And then the pistol shrimp has some AI on him where basically he's got 3 perch positions set up inside of the arena, and he would automatically detect the closest perched point to wherever that biolamp fell, and he would then move towards that perched position, sit on it, and then he would shoot the biolamp. Then he would go back to shooting you.
The voice acting for Aphotic Descent was overall a very interesting experience. It was my first game project where I was a voice actor and where I had to go and search out for other voice actors. Working with voice actors was a little discouraging at times because there wasn't as many people that were auditioning for the different roles that we had in the game when I was reaching out to these different voice acting discords. But at other times, working with voice actors was a great experience. Everyone that we had voice acting in our game was amazing, and I'm very grateful to have them be a part of our game. I'm especially grateful for my mom because she voiced one of our scientists at the very last minute because we couldn't find anyone else whose voice fit with the character.
So much has happened since we have been stationed on this cliffside. So much discovery and too much loss. I've requested that we return back to the main branch and that I may be relieved of my position.
She didn't have any prior experience with voice acting, but she was very excited to try it out, and she did a great job. It took a while to get all the voice acting actually into the game, but overall I am very happy with how it all turned out.
So we actually add more cinematics to the game, and not just more 2D panoramic shots, but also some 3D cutscenes as well. One of those first ones being the death of Freakfish. You either love him or hate him. He's dead. Swim high, sweet king, I will miss you forever and ever. Aside from that, on a lighter note, we had the zooplankton befriending scene, which I found to be probably the most cutesy and whimsical moments in the game, in which you're like, oh, nature's not all that bad. And it's almost kind of like a breath of fresh air because it's after a stressful situation and also before another stressful and dangerous situation. So it's just kind of like a moment that you're like, oh, this is very nice. And of course, following that, we have a few more of those like panoramic cutscenes. The Shrimp Love one starts off on a panoramic scene that kind of recounts what you just went through, as well as how you became a sudden heartbreaker, quite literally. And it has that panoramic shot that goes right into an animatic that just kind of conveys a little bit more of the story with kind of that different format instead of another panoramic shot, which I feel worked very well. And of course our final cutscene was the finale, in which it was the end. It was kind of a tragedy, or kind of a very mysterious end to the game. It's a little left open, but I feel like we kind of really wanted to convey kind of not really a happy ending, but not really the most depressing ending either.
So as we come closer to the end of the game, I wanted to put more of a focus on getting the music done and then having it be impactful. And because of that, I wanted to sort of reinforce the narrative ties to the music and how it plays throughout the story. So you'll find a lot of songs have different versions of them that have different meaning based off the context, but very similar or even the same melodies in some cases. A great example of that is the very first boss fight you find, the Frank Edelstein. In it, it's a two-faced boss that when you first are introduced to it, it's very calm and very sort of like melancholy, and so the song reflects that. But once you sort of get into the second phase, the eel is revived from its sort of death-like state and becomes enraged, much more faster, much more aggressive, constantly attacking. So I wanted the song to reflect that and sort of, up the pace, up the impact, added more of a emphasis and more of an electrical feel to the music as well. In a similar way, I played with a aspect of the story that had this tied to the dual boss fight you find later in the game, not to spoil too much. Basically, there's two different bosses with very similar origins. Both of them victims from the lab and both of them being the same sort of animal. So I wanted to have their themes both be, one, references to the narrative inspirations they have. If you figure this out, please don't sue me. But also, I wanted them to sort of tie together. So the very first boss fight has its own theme. And the second boss has its own theme as well. And sort of when they recombine and have the sort of dual boss fight mechanic happen, their songs combine to sort of play a more intense, fused version of that. Which I also then reused sort of for their tragic cutscene at the end. And I think that that narrative aspect played out well. There's many instances of this, and I hope you enjoy what you find.
Sprint 7 was when I finally got to finish the eel, honestly, and getting the mechanics in for it wasn't too difficult because it was just a black light mechanic and a knife mechanic. We had to make sure to incorporate the mechanics that we had so far, and that was how it was done. Honestly, most of the issues with it came in terms of conveyance, but getting it to work was honestly a pretty satisfying experience because getting to see, the reviving eel, it's got barnacles on its face. What do you do? It's pretty fun, pretty exciting, and I'm really happy with how the encounter turned out.
And so finally, we arrive at Sprint 9, which is our release to manufacturer sprint. It was just 1 week where basically everything had to get finished for the game. We finished the angler and his final mechanics, which had a lot of fine tuning. We finished any UI that had to get done, level touch-ups, polishing, particle effects, music, sounds, etc. We got the rest of the full cutscenes in. Just a whole bunch of changes that happened in the last week. It was a complete crazy week. We were all up on call for 16, 17 hours until the final build was done and ready for presentation and for being uploaded to Steam. But yeah, we eventually got there after everything, and the build came out great.
Aphotic Descent turned out to be a super magical and unforgettable experience for me, and I don't regret a single weird or crazy decision I had for the game. There's a rumor that me and Sarah ended up yassifying the game a bit, and I'm proud to say that the rumor is true, and I'll proudly do it again. The final day of class was actually a presentation and a showcase that the school hosted, and it felt really surreal standing in front of all my classmates, a lot of faculty, all my professors, and all of their families. And then it felt even more surreal to see our poster up on the Hall of Fame. And I ended up crying just a little bit. They were tears of joy, but I ended up crying a little bit because I never thought that I'd be in that position, and I never felt so honored to just work on a project and stand proudly next to it. We joke with our teammates that our brain is so full of aphotic descent. We love working on this game. We love working with each other, and we were kind of sad to see it officially end. And so deep down, I kind of want to work on like side stories, maybe a webtoon, a sequel game. But all in all, Aphotic Descent was truly a special experience, and I would proudly do it again, do it a million times, and continue working with my team because I love them and I love Aphotic Descent.
So actually, in the last stretch of making the game, I had the surprise of making the menu art for the game, which I found quite exciting. We did have a few ideas beforehand that were going to just include different parts of the game, but ultimately we landed on some 2D art, which was really fun. I went through tons of different iterations. I know some of the other people on the team got to hear me struggle a little bit and redo it and remake it a few different times, but I think the end product was really cool. And then with the help of our code lead Sean, he just kind of put a little pizzazz into it, honestly, and really made it pop and made it come to life. And I think it turned out pretty slay and pretty nice. I mean, hey, it looks beautiful. So I'm really proud of how everything turned out.
The finality, Sprint 9. Sprint 9 was only a week long, and boy, did it only feel like a week long, even though we probably had about a month's amount of work to do left, which I don't even know how we did all of it. It was a complete fever dream, the entire week, the entire day that it was due. I slightly remember doing some of it, but honestly not really. A lot of incomplete mechanics, cutscenes were finished the night the project was due. I stayed up till 5 a.m. working on fixing bugs and adding things in like the angler jump scare, fixing audio, adding audio, debugging pretty much just the entire game. There was just a bunch of stuff that was wasn't necessarily broken, but like there was a bunch of stuff that was just like, what's happening here kind of situation. Yeah, that whole day I worked on the cutscene for 7 hours while one of my other coders, Alejandro, was in the engine that entire time. And then basically once I finished the cutscene, I was like, okay, Alejandro, it's your break time now. Now I'll jump in. And then I worked till like 5 a.m. And then after that, my producer, my creative director had to make the video, and they were up till like 6 or 7 a.m. and we got it all done. And man, that Sprint 9 was crazy, but we did it. At the end of everything, we finished the game, and honestly, the time frame at which we did it was crazy. Yeah, it's just insane.
Sprint 9, huh? What a crazy build day. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure of what I did that night. But everything got in. I mean, the cutscenes were in, reworks were in, the angler puzzles were in, things like new jump scares, the overall feel, and just any bug fixes, they got done. And it was hard, it was arduous, but I'd say the final product turned out great because of it, so I'm pretty happy with it. Yeah.
In the end, Aphotic Descent came out to be an amazing project. I loved working with everyone. I think everyone on the team, the leads, all the artists, designers, coders, overall did a great job. The game looks unbelievable. I think everyone should be very proud of themselves. And I hope everyone is proud of their work. It's outstanding. There was a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of hard work that went into this game. And I hope everyone really enjoys it and that everyone out there really enjoys playing it. Before I go, though, I just want to talk about some few interesting stats that came from the creation of Aphotic Descent. One of them being that it took over a little over around 6,000 hours tracked on ClickUp between the 19 of us to create Aphotic Descent. And that's just tasks tracked on ClickUp. There's probably other hours that weren't tracked. It also took 596 pull requests and 1,293 commits in GitHub to make Aphotic Descent. Sorry, Sean, that we made you we had so many pull requests and commits, but it is what it is. And the last stat is that Gracie, our creative director, created over 45 different MS Paint drawings that were created within seconds, but ended up becoming some crazy kind of artwork or making the mechanic or encounter completely understandable just from these little drawings that we would pin on the fridge in our Discord server. And just explained her thought process really fast, but it's kind of, we'll show a couple of them on screen that were our favorites, but there were like 45 to 50 of them that ended up getting created. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.